My name is Mary, and what I'm about to share is one of the hardest experiences of my life. It's not something I ever imagined facing, but it's a story that deserves to be told. Perhaps someone out there, in a similarly unimaginable situation, might find strength in it. When I married Richard, I embraced the life that came with him, including his teenage son, David, from his previous marriage. David was 17 when I entered their lives, a reserved and quiet boy who seemed reluctant to let anyone into his world. Our interactions were cordial but distant, and I told myself it was understandable. Teenagers weren't known for being overly warm to new step-parents. I wanted to give him the space and time he needed to accept me into their lives. After all, becoming part of someone else's family is never straightforward. For the first year, everything seemed manageable. Richard's love made me feel secure, and David seemed to be slowly opening up. We were finding a rhythm as a family, or so I thought. The changes started subtly, so much so that I didn't even recognize them at first. David began spending more time around me when Richard wasn't home, hovering near the kitchen while I cooked, offering to help carry things or casually starting conversations. These weren't unusual behaviors in themselves, but there was a certain undertone to his presence that made me uneasy. His compliments lingered in my mind longer than they should have. "You look nice today, Mary," he said once, catching me by surprise as I arranged flowers in a vase. It was harmless enough, but the intensity in his eyes made my hands falter. I thanked him lightly and tried to dismiss the odd feeling. After all, teenagers often struggle with boundaries and emotions as they try to figure out the world and their place in it. But as weeks turned into months, the incidents became harder to ignore. His gaze would linger a little too long. He'd invent reasons to touch my shoulder or sit closer to me than was comfortable. I thought staying calm and distant would help, that if I remained steady and neutral, everything would naturally settle down. It seemed like a reasonable solution at the time, but in hindsight, I was naive. David didn't stop trying to get close. Every little thing he did seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The way he spoke to me in a softer tone than he used with anyone else, his increasing habit of finding reasons to be near me, and how he acted like our interactions were shared secrets. One cool evening, feeling particularly overwhelmed, I decided to sit in the garden to clear my mind. The air was crisp, and the scent of blooming flowers was a small comfort as I lost myself in thought. The doubts and unease that had been growing in my mind weighed heavily on me. I knew I had to do something but didn't know what. I thought I was alone until I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. "Mary," David's voice cut through the silence. It was quiet and almost hesitant. I turned to see him standing there, his hands buried deep in his pockets. For a moment I'd hoped he wanted to ask me something trivial, something innocent, but the weight in his gaze told me otherwise. I sighed, trying to muster my usual calm. "What is it, David?" I asked. He hesitated, then took a step closer. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Everything inside me screamed to say no, to avoid this conversation, but I couldn't avoid him forever. With reluctance, I nodded. "Okay. What do you want to say?" He sat down on the bench beside me, keeping some distance but not enough to set me at ease. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice almost trembling. "I know I've made things difficult for you, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. Part of me was afraid of where this was going. He looked down, avoiding my eyes. I don't know how to stop feeling the way I feel, but I don't want to hurt you or Dad." A wave of sadness and dread washed over me. I could hear the genuine struggle in his voice, but that didn't make this any easier. "David," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "You need to understand something. I love your father. He's a good man, and I want us to be a happy family. What you're feeling is understandable for someone your age, but it can't continue. You have to let it go." He nodded slightly, but his face remained troubled. "I've tried," he whispered, "but it's hard." "I know it's hard," I said, my voice steady but kind. But it's the right thing to do. You're a good person, David, and someday you'll find someone who feels the same way about you. But it can't be me. The silence that followed was suffocating. I hoped, prayed, that my words would sink in and help him see the reality of the situation. But a part of me wasn't sure. That night, I locked my bedroom door. It felt wrong, like I was treating him as a threat, but I couldn't ignore the unease I felt. I told myself it was a precaution, nothing more. But it didn't stop the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The next morning, David was unusually quiet. He barely spoke during breakfast and left the house early. A part of me felt relieved, but another part worried about what he was thinking. Was this his way of stepping back, or was something darker brewing in his mind? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. When Richard came home that evening, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. His presence grounded me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. But the weight of the secret I was carrying grew heavier. I wanted to tell him everything, but how could I? How could I shatter the peace of our home with such a painful truth? That night, lying next to Richard, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the room felt oppressive as I replayed every moment in my mind. I realized I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The silence was tearing me apart, and if I didn't speak up, it might destroy our family more than the truth ever could. The next morning after breakfast, I finally gathered the courage to say the words I'd been dreading. Richard, can we talk? It's important. He looked at me, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. Of course. What's going on? We sat in the living room, just the two of us. My hands were shaking and I could barely meet his eyes. Richard, I began, my voice trembling. I need to tell you something about David. His brow furrowed with concern. What about him? Is he okay? He's okay, I said quickly. But he's been struggling with something, and it's been difficult for me too. With great difficulty, I told him everything about David's behavior, the conversations, the moments that had left me feeling so conflicted. I tried to be as honest as possible without demonizing David. After all, he was still just a young man grappling with emotions he didn't know how to handle. But I didn't hold back the truth either. Richard's expression shifted as I spoke, from confusion to anger to deep sadness. When I finished, he sat back, rubbing his face with his hands. I can't believe this, he muttered. My own son. Tears welled up in my eyes. I'm so sorry, Richard. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. You should have told me sooner. I could have helped. I was scared, I admitted. I didn't want to ruin our family. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. I understand. But we need to fix this. That afternoon, when David came home, Richard called him into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, my heart pounding as their voices rose and fell in the other room. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of the conversation. When Richard came back to the kitchen, he looked exhausted, but calm. We talked, he said. David understands what he did was wrong. He's going to stay with his aunt for a while to give us all some space. Relief washed over me, though it was bittersweet. Do you think he'll be okay? I asked softly. He'll need time, Richard said, but he's young. He'll move on. That night, as Richard held my hand, he looked at me and said, We'll get through this. Together. I nodded, finally feeling the weight beginning to lift. Yes, I whispered. Together. And with that, our family began the long journey toward healing.